The last time I sat in that church, I was 19 years old. The benches were the same hard wood they had always been. The windows were the same plain glass. And the bishop stood at the front of the room the same way he always stood, like the weight of God's judgment lived in his shoulders. I remember looking at my hands in my lap and thinking, if I am very still, he will not see me. I had learned that by then. It had taken me 3 years to learn it, but I had. My name is Anna. I am 80 years old. I grew up Old Order Amish in Wayne County, Ohio, and I left, truly left in my heart, not just in my body, the year I turned 19. What I am about to tell you, I have not spoken out loud in its entirety to anyone except my daughter and one therapist, who was a kind woman in her 50s who cried twice during our sessions and apologized both times. I told her not to apologize. I told her the crying meant she had understood. If you are here because you want to understand what Amish life is actually like, not the quilts, not the buggies, not the peaceful farms you see on calendars, stay with me, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, did you grow up somewhere that taught you that obedience and silence were the same thing? Because I did, and it cost me 60 years before I could say so. I need you to understand something about the world I was born into before I tell you what happened inside it. In the old order community of my childhood in the 1950s and 1960s, the bishop was not simply a religious leader. He was the final word on every question a life could produce. Whether a family could keep a piece of equipment, whether a young man's behavior warranted a private conversation or a public one, whether a girl who had been seen speaking to an English boy at the feed store needed to be addressed before the congregation or only privately in the back room of whoever's home was hosting church that Sunday. The ordnung governed everything, but the bishop governed the ordnung. And in our district, from the time I was 16 until the time I left at 19, our bishop was a man named with a name I will not say out loud, because his grandchildren are still living, and I have not come here for revenge. I have come here for the record. I want there to be a record. He was considered a good bishop, strict, people said, but fair, consistent, not given to favoritism. The older women in the community spoke of him with a particular kind of respect that I now understand was partly relief. Relief that his attention had never fully settled on them or on their daughters. Because here is what no one said plainly. Not then, not ever. There was a category of infraction that the bishop handled alone, not with deacons present, not with a minister witnessing, alone. They were always girls. The infractions were never large. In my memory, not one of them would register as meaningful in any world outside our fence. A girl who had been heard laughing too loudly on the way home from a singing. A girl who had worn her prayer cap slightly too far back on her head, showing more hair than was permitted. A girl whose eyes, the bishop said, had been lingering on things that did not concern her. That last one was me. I was 16. I had been looking out the window during the sermon, not defiantly, not knowingly, just a girl whose mind had wandered for a moment toward the sky. And afterward, the deacon's wife touched my sleeve and said quietly that the bishop wanted a word. I want to tell you what that sentence felt like. It felt like the floor had become uncertain. Not like I had done something wrong. I had not done something wrong, and I knew it. It felt like the floor had become uncertain because the rules were not really about what you did. The rules were about whether you had been noticed. and I had been noticed. The conversation happened in the back room of the Zook family's home, where church had been held that week. The room had a wooden table and 2 chairs, and a small window with no curtain. He closed the door. He did not lock it. There was no lock. But a closed door in an Amish home in 1956, in the middle of a church Sunday, was its own kind of lock. What he did in that room was not physical. I want to be precise because precision matters, because the absence of physical harm was exactly how it stayed invisible for so long. What he did was speak, for a long time, about my soul, about the danger a girl's wandering eyes represented, to herself, to the young men around her, to the fabric of the community, about what happened to girls who could not discipline their attention, about the mercy he was offering me by addressing this privately, rather than before the congregation. He made me recite aloud a list of my faults. Things I had not known were faults until that afternoon. The list took a long time. He added to it twice. When it was done, he said he would be watching. That watching was part of his calling, that I should be grateful someone was watching. I was 16 years old. I walked out of that room and rejoined the Sunday meal, and no one asked me anything, because no one ever asked anything about what happened behind that door. That was the agreement the community had made without discussing it. The door was the agreement. He called me back 11 more times over the next 3 years. What happened over the next 11 Sundays? I cannot carry it in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. The names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and pinned in the first comment. I was not the only one. That is the sentence I need you to hold. There was a girl named Miriam, 2 years younger than me, who had been called back 4 times by the time I left. I know because we told each other, not directly, not sitting down with the intention of sharing something. The way it happened was this. We were washing dishes together after a Sunday meal, just the 2 of us, and she dropped a plate and said quietly, looking at the broken pieces on the floor, "I hate Sundays." I looked at her, and she looked at me, and we did not say another word about it for 6 years. But in that moment we knew. We both knew. And knowing together, even in silence, was the only mercy either of us had. There was a girl named Ruth, whose mother had figured something out. I do not know how. I do not know what she saw. And who began, the following winter, sending Ruth to stay with relatives in a neighboring district on church Sundays. The excuse was always Ruth's health. Ruth was never sick a day in her life. Her mother never explained, and Ruth never asked her to. They understood each other in the way women in that world learn to understand each other. Sideways, without naming. Because naming was dangerous, and silence was the only protection anyone could offer. Ruth's mother knew the door was a problem. She could not say it. She could not bring it to the deacons or write it down or sit across from a bishop in a neighboring district and say, "The man leading our church is using a closed door, and the language of God's judgment to do something to our daughters that has no name but leaves marks." She could not do any of that. What she could do was change where her daughter was on Sunday mornings. And she did that every Sunday for 2 years until the family moved. That is what resistance looked like. It did not look like speaking. It looked like finding the one small thing you could actually move and moving it quietly, without explanation, and hoping it was enough. When I left, the shunning came quickly. My family, my parents, my 3 sisters, my brother, all followed the Ordnung as they had been raised to follow it. Letters not returned because there were no letters. Phone calls not answered because there were no phones yet. And by the time there were, the silence had calcified into something harder than habit. My mother and I spoke once, briefly, in a parking lot when I was 26 and she was 53. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has chosen a path you cannot follow. I do not think she was wrong to look at me that way. I think she was afraid. I think she had been afraid for a long time, and the fear had nowhere to go. It was not until I was in my 40s, after my children were grown, after a divorce, after a therapist in Columbus who cried twice and apologized both times, that I found the word for what the bishop had been doing. Not the physical word, because again, he never touched me, but the other word, the one that describes what happens when someone with absolute authority uses that authority to enter the interior of a young person's sense of themselves and rearrange it to suit his purposes. The word is abuse. It does not require physical contact. It requires only the door and the language, and the certainty that no one will ask what happened behind it. It requires a community that has agreed, without discussing it, that the bishop's judgment is God's judgment, and that God does not answer to questions. My therapist said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "The most durable systems of harm are the ones that don't look like harm from the outside. They look like order. They look like discipline. They look like a community that takes its children seriously enough to correct them." I looked like a girl being corrected. I was 16. I did not know I had the right to say, "I will not go through that door." No one had told me that right existed. No one had told Miriam. No one had told Ruth, though her mother guessed at it and spent 2 winters protecting her in the only way she knew. I am 80 years old. My hands look nothing like they did in that back room. My hair is white, and I keep it the way I want to keep it. I have sat with my daughter and told her everything, and she held my hands for a long time, and then she said, "I'm glad you got out." I told her, "Getting out took everything I had." She said, "I know, I can see it." The Amish world gave me things I carry with dignity, a knowledge of silence that is sometimes peace, a relationship with work that has never left me, a faith fractured, rebuilt, strange, mine, that survived everything it was put through. I do not tell this story to condemn every person who lives inside that world. Most of them are trying, the same way most people everywhere are trying. But there was a door, and behind it, a man who had been given so much authority that no one, not a deacon, not a father, not a mother except one who had to pretend her daughter was sick, could stand between him and a girl's sense of herself. And if you grew up somewhere that had a door like that, a room, a title, a language, a silence, I am telling you now what no one told me then. You were not being corrected. You were being controlled. And the fear you felt walking toward that door was not weakness. It was your body knowing something true that no one around you would confirm. I am confirming it now, 60 years late. I am confirming it. The Sundays, what 20 minutes cannot hold. The link is in the description and pinned in the first comment. The morning is yours if you decide it is.